A reason that the Torah and the unitive way match up so well, I think, is that the Torah is full of two main things: narratives and rules, of course. And narratives and rules are both primarily about relationships. Of course, rules are going to come up in an ethics class. Rules are fundamental to moral frameworks, just about every moral framework. Rules are key, of course, to the covenant of Moses. Its 613 commandments, or mitzvot, are the terms of this arrangement God is making with his people. And rules are also still significant, truly significant, in the new covenant to the operations of what 1 Peter 4:17 calls the household of God. God's people are like the inhabitants of God's household, and a household has house rules. Well, Israel has house rules, and the church has house rules. Here is a key principle for understanding what rules are and what rules are for. Relationships imply rules, and rules reflect relationships and structure those relationships. The order of these two things is important. Rules reflect relationships more than the other way around. Legalists get this backwards and think that if I live according to rules, I will get relationships. It's the other way around, at least it is with God. The relationships come first, and the laws and the rules of that relationship reflect it. Here are a few places in both Testaments where you see this. Breaking the covenant doesn't end Israel's relationship with God. It jeopardizes it, but God sees them through. In Hosea 11, God looks at Israel's long past of unfaithfulness, which is like that of an adulterous wife, and says, "How can I let you go? You belong to me. I'm going to bring you back, and I'm going to restore you." Moreover, keeping rules but in an insincere way fulfills the letter of the law, but it doesn't reflect the point of that rule, or its intended structure, or its ultimate role. Here's a famous passage from the prophet Amos. It's famous in America anyway, because Martin Luther King made it famous. God tells Israel, I despise your feasts, your holiday celebrations. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I won't accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I won't even look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen. But let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. When Americans hear these verses, we can't help but think of the civil rights movement and the way that Americans were being called to treat each other justly. But the verses in Amos that follow this passage show that the real offense to God is idolatry. Verse 25, "Did you bring to me sacrifices and offerings during the 40 years in the wilderness, house of Israel? You will take up Sikkuth your king and Kiyun your star god, your images that you made for yourselves, and I will send you and your false gods with you into exile." Here you can see God is not so much interested in us following the directions for worship by the letter, as he's interested in the relationships that those directions are meant to honor. Rules also always come with side effects, whether intended or not. Even good and just rules generate two categories of people: rule followers, who get a little too focused on the rules themselves, and rule breakers, who focus on the rules themselves but in the opposite way, as impediments or obstacles to be overcome. As a teacher, I see this with grades. Grades are rules that reflect a relationship of learning between a student and a teacher. But the rules create a whole different power relationship. How much do I need to do to get this grade? What can I do to get around the requirement? Or how do I slavishly follow the requirements to make sure that I get a good grade? Rules about assignments, rules about attendance, and so on. They may be well intended. They might even be necessary. But they tend to be the tail that wags the dog. They redefine the relationship that they were meant to reflect. Pastor Tim Keller has a great interpretation of the parable of the prodigal son, where each son represents a failed way to live. There is, of course, the wayward son and his way of disobedience. But the good son, the obedient son's way of obedience, turns out also to have alienated him from his father. Rather, they were interested in the benefits of the relationship. They had goodness gets mindsets that ended up distorting the relationships that they should have had with their father and with one another. And of course, these two sons refer to the obedient Jews and the disobedient Jews that are at odds, and the unhappiness of the obedient Jews with the fact that Jesus is cavorting with the disobedient ones. Jesus is about reconciling, not just reconciling the disobedient to God, but reconciling the obedient to God. So if the rules aren't fundamental, if they're built on the relationship, and if the rules don't work as advertised, in fact, if they introduce new distortions to that very relationship, then what is the covenant for? There will be a variety of answers coming, but for now, let's just say that they do illustrate the relationship between grace, which is the foundation of this relationship in the first place, and responsibility. The responsibility, particularly of human beings, to honor that relationship. Israel's origin with the patriarchs and Israel's constitution at Sinai, its formation as the people that God wants it to be under this covenant, both display God's grace in the midst of human irresponsibility and human incapacity. Remember, the wreckage at the end of Genesis 11 is the result of this human irresponsibility and the human incapacity that God has had to give us to restrain us in our sin and depravity. And that grace arouses righteousness. Not a lot, but a mustard seed's worth, you might say. Righteousness is evident in Genesis 15 in Abraham's faith in God's promises. Moses promises in Deuteronomy 6:25 that obeying God's rules will be righteousness for Israel. And righteousness is sporadic but present. You see it especially clustered around King David, whose heart went fully after God. And this is beginning to indicate the kind of righteousness that God is after and how it comes about. The role of righteousness as the proper response to grace signals the responsibility that follows grace. Here are 6 common pictures of grace and responsibility, and each one implies a certain kind of relationship. History reveals a variety of incompatible accounts of grace and what follows it. There is what I'll call self-grace, which is really no grace at all. It's just self-indulgence. It's just slackness. It's settling for accepting ourselves the way we are. Well, that would have left everyone at Genesis 11 instead of pointing forward to a better future. Here, authenticity, just accepting oneself as is treated as if it's responsibility, when really it's a very different thing. You might think of the mindset of goodness expressing itself in an existential way as a kind of self-grace, accepting ourselves as is or defining ourselves as we choose to will ourselves to become. A second picture I'm going to call pseudo-grace, false grace. The idea that we initiate the restoration of our relationship with God through our own obedience. That's legalism. Legalism is the self-responsibility of supposedly free agents, free wills. And it's a nice concept unless those wills aren't free in the first place. It doesn't work if human beings aren't in the position to initiate that ascent to God. After all, in Genesis 11, people did initiate an ascent to God. We built a tower to try to make a name for ourselves and reach Him out of our own efforts, not out of trust, but out of pretense. A third picture, and also a false picture, of grace and responsibility is cheap grace. The idea that God just lowers standards so that we pass the low standard. This is like self-grace, but with God as the one with the low standards, not ourselves. Another word for this is license, just letting people get away with whatever. And license is irresponsibility, not responsibility. And it encourages further irresponsibility. Cheap grace leads a lot of people into lives that don't look any different than they would have been without their so-called faith, without receiving that grace in the first place. A fourth picture of grace and responsibility, which some Protestants will argue is the New Testament picture, is I'm going to call Ragamuffin Grace, after a famous book called The Ragamuffin Gospel. Ragamuffins are just kind of losers. The idea here is that grace is God meeting the standards for us through the grace of Jesus Christ, regarding us righteous, even though we're not, and really that's the end of the story. God doesn't lower His standards, God just meets the standards and leaves us where we were. However, Ragamuffin Grace never restores responsibility back to us after God has taken it. We aren't responsible back, nor are we ever made responsible back. And this takes us back to cheap grace. God is indulgent. A fifth picture of grace and responsibility I'm going to call one-time only grace. God forgives us. God restores this relationship, maybe through the grace of faith at baptism. But then it's up to us to be righteous as God requires. You might say that God takes responsibility at first, but then hands it all right back to us, permanently back to us. We're answerable, but the fact is we're still undependable. We're still inclined towards the depravity that got us into the mess in the first place. So God isn't really dependable either, because he keeps putting us in positions we can't handle. And after God's first intervention, we are on our own. Some voices in the early church, the rigorists, taught something like a one-time only grace doctrine, where you really could not get pardoned for any major sins after your baptism. And as a result, people would put their baptism off as long as they could, just to minimize the risks. Not necessarily so they could indulge themselves, as just to minimize the risk because they knew they were undependable. The sixth picture, which I think is the biblical picture throughout in both testaments, I will call restoring grace. God meets the standards for us because we can't at first. God bears our refusals and our resistance the way a loving parent or spouse or friend endures the wounds of the less dependable one. But along the way, God equips us to heal and to grow and someday become dependable so that we can even inherit his kingdom. Here, all parties are taking responsibility, and the responsibilities grow as our capacities grow. And the story of our relationship is growing capacity because of restoring grace. Rules have some kind of place in each of those relationships, but it's only the restoring grace relationship where rules look like the story of the Torah looks in the Bible as the story goes on. Deuteronomy 5:6 frames all of these commandments relationally, I am the God who brought you out of Egypt, and historically, I have done these things, and so now this is how you will respond. Grace creates relationships that involve responsibilities. The Psalms treasure the Torah, especially Psalm 119, which is one long ode to the Word of God, which is really especially the covenant. The Psalms treasure this covenant, but the psalmists don't depend on covenant obedience for their relationship with God. A number of the Psalms simply fall at God's face and beg for forgiveness, and there's no mention of obeying all the rules required by the covenant to secure forgiveness and pardon. That was one of the qualities of the Psalms that really struck Martin Luther as he was teaching them in his capacity as a teacher, that David seems to be justified by grace through faith rather than obedience to his own covenant. The histories of Israel in the Torah and then in the former prophets, they affirm this relationship. They affirm those rules and this covenant, but they also acknowledge the limits of that covenant. Even when Israel is outwardly obedient, its heart is wrong. Often enough, Israel is disobedient, but the latter prophets, the major and minor ones, don't foresee the law just being abolished or just simply reinstated the way it had been at the beginning. Instead, the prophets foresee a transformation and a change and a fulfillment of the spirit of that covenant in a renewal. Jeremiah 31's new covenant is really the substance of the old covenant, but it's written on the hearts of Israel instead of just on their walls. And therefore, it's really not just the old covenant. It's a whole new kind of arrangement. It's new rules that reflect a changed relationship. So Messiah was not expected to abolish the rules. After all, relationships imply rules. In a sense, no rules means no relationship. The Messiah wasn't going to bring an end to the rules any more than he would end the relationship. The Messiah was coming to bring about the arrangement that the Torah had always anticipated, but never yet delivered. It's well known how many of these rules concern Israel's worship relationship with the Lord. Those directions are treated differently, distinguished from the regulations that apply to ordinary human relationships. Families, clans, neighbors, strangers, the accused, regulations involving what we would label justice. Both of those sets of rules are treated differently than rules about hygiene, cleanliness. And we see that in the way that God complains about Israel treating one another and then coming to God with its sacrifices. And he says, I'm not going to receive your sacrifices the way you're treating each other. That's a lot of nuance, and Israel is just getting started. If you look at the Jewish traditions of jurisprudence, of interpretation of Torah. The Mishnah and the Talmud are so expansive in the ways that these rules are interpreted in Israel's changing circumstances and conditions. Rules are complicated things, even when an underlying relationship isn't so complicated.